going to be taking a look at Psalms 104 tonight. And similar to Psalms 93, like we looked at on Sunday, we're going to see an outline here, just in many more details about some of the acts of creation, some of God's handiworks, some of the things that He's created for us. Except this time, instead of 5 or 6 verses, we have 35 verses where this is detailed. And what's really so cool about this is we're going to see some of the pivotal moments in the Genesis account, like the flood, really described in a poetic form. You know, this class really deals with a lot of poetry in Psalms, and this particular chapter gives us such a heavy dose of that poetry, and really just makes it such a beautiful account, and, you know, similar to what we talked about on Sunday, helps establish our faith even more. With that in mind, we open with a very symbolic expression here, and we'll go ahead and read the first 5 verses just to get a taste of how the psalmist is writing this. Chad, I haven't forgot your name now. Please read the first 5 verses for us, if you would.
Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of the chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes his messenger winds, his ministers a flaming fire. He sets the earth on its foundation so that it should never be moved. You say just the first 5?
Yeah, thank you. There's so many deep and rich words that are used in these first 5 verses, and probably one of my favorite expressions is when he talks about the light. You know, the entire act of creation can be summed up to, you know, the creation of light, the creation of the things on the earth. And the psalmist chooses to have the picture of God being wrapped in that light, as if it's a garment. And I think it's such a beautiful way to describe God's glory, His majesty, and some of the things that He's created here on the earth. We see here he says that He makes the clouds His chariot. He walks upon the wings of the clouds. We see that there's very distinct imagery in what God, you know, directs from His creation, or the control that He's able to exercise over it. Particularly in these last 3 verses in the first 5, what kind of imagery really tells us about the power that God has over His creation? What are some of the ways in which He describes that to us here, the psalmist?
I love the Lord wraps Himself in light as with a garment. So He, you know, light is something that we can't really manipulate too easily, and yet God can grab it and touch it and wrap it around Himself.
Yeah, absolutely. When I think about this, I think God is the master architect of all that He's put in this world, all that's visible, all that's tangible, anything that we can sense with our senses. You know, I thought about, you know, early 2000s games like The Sims or Minecraft, where you're able to build any kind of world that you want to build, right? You know, remember these computer games where you could do all sorts of different things. And I couldn't help but just think in the language that the psalmist uses, particularly in these first 5 verses, how he's able to take, you know, physical objects or things to us and bend them and make them, mold them into things that are beautiful, you know, to us in a way that we're not able to.
He creates the very foundation of it. I mean,
Yeah.
He's the foundation, and He adorns it with all these other things. And it's just, if you don't see the glory of God in His handiwork, I guess you're blind, because it's just everywhere. And I think that the light, like he says, He paints it with that. It goes and reveals it to us. And I think that's what, as we look around, you can't deny God. And I think that's what the psalmist here is trying to say, is He is everywhere. Open your eyes, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely, Don. One thing that I thought about when I was reading, particularly his message here about how He walks upon the wings of the wind, He makes the winds His messengers, it connects similarly to what the account in the New Testament, particularly when Jesus is out on the sea, and, you know, some of the disciples and people that are watching say, you know, who is this that the wind and the seas obey him? He's able to give commands over his creation, right? The things that he has created, he's able to instruct it, he's able to make it bend to his will. And I think that, similar to what you said, Don, it's just such a faith-building exercise. Moving on, you honed in on something, though, that I want to pick up on in a little greater detail, particularly in verse 5 here, where he says that he established the earth upon its foundations so that it will not totter forever and ever. We see the psalmist make two distinct declarations here. One in that who created the earth, and also I think what's interesting is he comments on the surety of its design. This wasn't by chance. This wasn't by a mere accident that these things happened. And we talked about on Sunday, I think it was Jay that mentioned, you know, it's such a faith-building exercise to contemplate some of these things and think about all that the Lord has done. And I was looking at some random facts to put some more color to this particular point. And the chance that this earth was created by random life arranging itself without any sort of omnipotence or design is the odds of 10 to the 40,000th power. So it's, you know, 40,000 zeros. There's debate on what some of those inputs are used. You can get 1 to the, you know, 3 millionth power. The point is, it's a non-trivial number, right? At the end of the day, it's something that's so vast that it can't be described by the things that we have at our disposal. And I think that so oftentimes, man, when we cannot understand something, we want to ascribe luck or chance to something that we don't fully comprehend. And I think that oftentimes we don't understand things like that, and so we want to fit our interpretation to it. People have been saying that, you know, it's all by luck, it's just a matter of odds. But I think the psalmist here gives us a very, very important understanding of what that means, particularly here.
It just made me think about, I haven't seen it, but the movie Oppenheimer's come out. But Enrico Fermi, you know, I think he was the first to create a radioactive reaction. You know, he was one of the leading scientists, and what came to be known as the Fermi paradox, he sort of raised the rhetorical questioning, well, you know, these things happen by chance, where are they? And what he meant by that, other civilizations that got a many millions of years head start on us. And what he was pointing to was the fact that there were particular aspects of the earth that make life possible. But when he said that, I forget the exact numbers, there were maybe 6, 7, 8 things, you know, the tilt of the earth on its axis and this and that. Well, since then, people have thought more about that, we've learned more, and now it's referred to as sort of the rare earth paradox. And there's something of just things we know about, something like 200 particular aspects of the way the earth is and where it sits in the solar system and the size of the sun and things that get down on this earth level, why life can be sustained here. And it leads to the very numbers you quoted, and it leads back to Psalms here, that the Lord took things that were unstable, he took things that are lifeless, and he made his earth that is so inhabitable by humans.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. It's great context and another good example when we think about the magnitude of the things that we take for granted every day, and the fact that they did not happen by chance. They weren't arranged just by somebody playing with Legos and hoping that, you know, a miraculous structure is built. It's clear that, you know, you can go to all these amazing places around the world, you know, similar to the pictures that we looked at before. You go to, you know, I'm biased, you go to Arizona, you look at the Grand Canyon, for instance, or some of these incredible structures, and think that it was just, you know, happenstance that those things were created. And I think that, you know, it goes back to when we think about, oh, it was just luck. luck's usually an excuse for not thinking hard enough, I think, about what's actually happening. And instead of, we have the answer right here in front of us, we have to come up with our own spin on it, or man's own spin. Any other comments before we move on to verses 6 through 9? Yeah.
A trap that I fell into several years ago, as a kid, me and my classes, we would talk about stuff like the chants or design. We talked a lot about evidences. And I sort of thought of, I was somewhat familiar with a lot of the things people bring up, that the likelihood or unlikelihood that this happened by chance, that kind of thing. And the trap that I think I can fall into is using it purely as a proof, thinking, what can I use this information for? And what I'm learning is to just take a step back and marvel at it for its own sake. That's kind of what I think this psalm is talking about. Certainly there is a time to say, this proves God, but I think there's also a time to just step back and enjoy the view of the Grand Canyon, enjoy what God has given us and the assurance that it gives us in who he is. The psalm ends with, may your glory endure forever. I will sing to you as long as I live. And so I just find it interesting that there are whole songs dedicated to just praising him and letting that be enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's many different accounts, particularly in Psalms here, where you take some of the most foundational passages in Genesis, and the psalmist adds so much color to them. He adds so much poetic nature to them, and it really just injects them, I think, with a beauty that we're able to appreciate. Moving on, let's go ahead and read verses 6 through 9. Ryan, would you mind reading them?
Yeah. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. As your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. Yet you set a boundary that they may not pass, so they may not again cover the earth.
Thank you. What Genesis event is this referencing? Flood? Yeah. Right up there. I think it's interesting that the psalmist once again gives so much color to a common story that we all know, particularly here with the flood, talking about how the waves, how they obey his voice at his rebuke, they fled. The mountains then rose, of course, after the flood was over. The valleys sank down to the place which you established. And God set a boundary that they may not pass over, referencing again the covenant that he made with Noah and that he wouldn't destroy the earth by water again. Such an interesting way to describe, a common story that we all know. Looking at verses 10 through 13 now, we're going to keep moving here. It reads, he sends forth springs in the valleys. They flow between the mountains. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. Besides them, the birds of the heavens dwell. They lift up their voices among the branches. He waters the mountains from his upper chambers. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of his works. We see him transition now when he's talking about water and particularly what it did during the flood, and then how God, used that in order to wipe man from the earth and, hit the restart button. He switches now to using it in a very nourishing aspect and talking about some of the things that God uses water for on the earth today. Giving animals the ability to drink, feeding the vegetation. And it's an interesting contrast and something that I appreciate because the psalmist never looks at things in a very one-sided view. There's always usually different angles that are given to us, whether through destruction or through creation, as in this instance right here. Any comments on these 4 or 5 verses here? One other thing I want to make note of is how the psalmist gives credit for the plan that God had from the beginning. You know, we see obviously there's a lot of chaos happening, particularly in this account with the flood. But he pivots very quickly and shows how God had a plan from the beginning, how to save man with the flood. He also made a plan for how to take care of his creation, how to keep it going, how to fertilize it. And it just speaks to, I think, the psalmist's point of his frame of mind and the things that he's thinking of. Let's go ahead and read verses 14 through 18 now. Can I have a volunteer to read 14 through 18? Yeah.
You cause the grass to grow for the livestock and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. In them the birds build their nests, the stork has her home in the fir trees. The high mountains are for the wild goats, the rocks are a refuge for the rock badgers.
Thank you. What do we see from these 4 or 5 verses here? After God talks about the water and what he's doing to provide for the vegetation, the animals, what do we see him pivot to here in these verses?
Provided for us, for humans.
Right. Yeah. God's always made sure that man is provided for. He shows how he has a plan for everything, to take care of everything, whether it's animals, whether it's mankind, whether it's plants. Nothing is without purpose in God's eyes. And he also gave every piece of creation a purpose. Moving on in verses 19 through 23 here now, starting verse 19, says, He made the moon for seasons. The sun knows the place of its setting. You appoint darkness, and it becomes night, in which all the beasts of the forest prowl about. The young lions roar after their prey and seek their food from God. When the sun rises, they withdraw and lie down in their dens. And man goes forth to his work and to his labor until evening. Speaking again to that piece of every item on earth has its purpose. We see here that, the animals, they have their purpose. Man has a purpose. And we see that they're provided for at the end of the day, by God.
Isaac's comment kind of got me thinking. I think he's exactly right. I think that these kind of psalms often should cause us to just sort of relish in and appreciate and look to God and praise Him. But also, like all of God's statements, I think for Psalms writers, they may have, in addition, things that lie behind the scenes or other layers of use of these, even if they didn't have that in mind. One might be toward that outright skeptic, that, hey, this shows plan, design. But I think for us, the fact we're here suggests there are probably not many just outright agnostics and skeptics. But I think sometimes I'll say myself, I suffer from the skepticism of indifference, the agnosticism of complacency. All these things he's talking about are around us, or if they're not visibly around us, we can turn on some documentary and see it. And yet, because it's like the example sometimes used that, hey, when one fish says to the other, isn't the water great? And the other fish says, what water? We're so in it that we don't see it. And I think Psalms like this are very good to help break us out of that, that sort of indifference toward God, and indifferent that He really has set us up, as he says in another psalm, in a way that sort of defies explanation. Why would you consider us so much?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I think about some of the things that we have at our disposal just to appreciate some of the things of creation. For instance, one of the things I love to put on that my wife thinks I'm crazy for is Our Planet on Netflix, where you just watch all the vastness of the different ecosystems and how they work. And you think about, we've talked about the Apollo 11 missions and the pictures that you've seen from the Earth. What you can see on Our Planet or Blue Planet or all the different versions they've got now, I mean, it just surpasses almost anything that was image created 40, 50 years ago. And you think about all the accomplishments of man, the things that we've done, yet so many times we can't see what's right in front of us. And I think that's a great way to put it, Brian. It's an eloquent way, much more eloquent than I was thinking of.
Yeah, just on the heels of that.
Yeah.
Another thing that's a healthy exercise to do is when you live out your day, maybe at night before you go to bed, for those of you that like to keep a journal, just write down some things that I saw today that made me realize God exists. And if you do that a few days in a row, you'll have a nice little list of things that, and then you find yourself noticing those things throughout the day, and it's good to build your faith that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. If you're not intentional about those things, then they never get done.
You don't see them, you don't recognize them.
Yeah.
You're going to reflect on your day and think about the things that I saw. It makes you more intentional, like you said.
Absolutely. They're just a passing thought, I think, until we actually put words to them and meditate on them and think about them. Let's look at any other comments before we move on? Okay, let's look at verse 24 here. Verse 24 says, O Lord, how many are your works? In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions. What reminder does the psalmist give us here in verse 24?
That God made everything, and that everything belongs to Him.
Absolutely.
And the wisdom of what he's done.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of particularly, is that at the end of the day, we do have these great examples of, the wisdom of God, the things that He's bestowed and given us stewardship of. But really, at the end of the day, they're all the Lord's. We're merely stewards of them. We have an obligation to enjoy them in a respectful way, to take care of them in a certain way. One of the favorite metaphors that I've always liked, that I heard a preacher say many, many years ago, is that, at the end of the day, life is like a game of Monopoly. And at the end of the day, once you've got all the properties, all of the things, it all goes back in the box at the end of the day. And I think that's so true about our world. The things that God's given us, all the marvels that He's created for us, they're going to go back in the box too at some point. And we've got a responsibility to enjoy them in a respectful way.
I think it's also important that he says, in wisdom have you made them all. I can remember when I was probably 10 or so thinking, like, why did God make mosquitoes? Why did He make wasps? And now I'm thinking,
I still ask that.
Right, exactly. And why did He make, why do hurricanes form? Why do tornadoes? All these different things that are His works. They're part of His creation, and there's wisdom behind it. There's intent behind it, and so knowing that helps me because I can start thinking in that way, especially because we're talking in a very, poetic, somewhat abstract context sometimes. So it helps to be reminded that this was all made in wisdom. So let me try and figure out, why is this here? Whether it be some annoying bug or the tornadoes that killed so many people, why is this here? Instead of just assuming that it was, again, chance and just the product of an uncaring universe.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting point too, and it reminded me of something in contrast to some of the language that Jesus uses in the New Testament. When we think about the tone of how the psalmist speaks in many of the Psalms versus the tone that Jesus uses, I think oftentimes, and I don't want to spend too long on this, but I think oftentimes Jesus spoke in a very esoteric way to the Pharisees, to the religious leaders that few people were understanding. It was a different type of message, but here in the Psalms, this is something that everybody identifies with. I think that he does such a good job of using powerful descriptors that it's clearly known the point he's trying to make and what particularly he's trying to connect to. So one other question I want to leave us with here is, we think about all of the dependence that God's creations have on him and our dependence on him. What particular parallel can we draw to this today when it comes to our needs, the worries that we might have for our needs, and things of that nature?
One of my favorite aspects of this psalm is to read about the young lions who roar after their prey, and God feeds them. He opens his hand and they receive from him. And I think the lion goes out and takes his prey, right? No. God gives it to him. And I think I go out and earn something, and I don't. It's given to me by God. And if we're tempted to look and think, I did this, or I achieved that, or no more so than the lion that, takes his prey. No, God opens his hand and gives it to him. And if God refrains from that, then they're terrified. And that image is very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Just because effort is put forth on our part, or we associate effort with cause, is a mistake, I think, and that's a great way to remember that.
Oh, Elliot, your
Yeah.
question there, I think about Jesus. He made the parallel when he was talking to his disciples about worry and anxiety, and he uses the birds, the lilies, the flowers.
You're reading my notes, Randy. Absolutely.
So it's, obviously when we read this, hopefully we reflect on that this is exactly what Jesus is talking about. Who knows if he was thinking of this? More than likely he was, or similar Psalms or Proverbs, that this is what we need to look at nature, at God's creation, and realize it is so massive and beyond our control, but yet, like Brett was saying, we think we're in control. We think that everything depends on my every decision. He's saying, hey, rest easy knowing that God has created all of this and he has it all under control.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the analogy to, that passage in Matthew chapter 6. It's exactly what I thought of when I was reading this for the first time. I thought, this is really just a personification or a more colorful account of that exact analogy that Jesus draws out in chapter 6 of Matthew there, where he talks about the lilies of the field and how they toil, but they don't want for anything, and they're clothed in splendor. And there's a lot of imagery used to paint that picture that God will provide for us today. And I think that in this account, we just see that detailed in 30-some verses. It just really drives that point home. Any more comments, particularly around this?
I've thought of the same scripture you was just mentioning, and I've always been interested in what he has to say about the cedars. And in this chapter it says, the trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. And then in 29 it said that with his voice he could break the cedars. And then in Hosea it says that God would be like dew to Israel, that they would blossom like the lily, and that they would take root like the cedars. And then in the New Testament we're told to consider the lily. Maybe I connected too many dots,
No.
but it's hard to read these passages and not think of those ones for me.
Yeah, I don't think so at all. In fact, I was actually looking at what you were referencing, the cedars of Lebanon. I was looking at some images of those things because I found that was mentioned as well throughout several accounts and even in the New Testament in Matthew 6. And if you have some time, I would definitely recommend just do a quick Google search on these things. They're extremely massive. The only thing I can relate it to is, maybe the sequoia trees that we have out west, on the west coast, in parts of California and Oregon. But they're just massive trees, and yet, God provides for them, God takes care of them, and yet, his power is so great that he can snap them, like a toothpick. And I think it just adds again to the color that we see here.
Your question and Randy's comment made me think about, I'm often thinking, Lord, I've got this need, why are you taking care of it? I think this psalm really points us in an entirely different direction. Lord, why have you given me so many things? It is easy to not focus on all the things. I mean, he's given us the very breath we have, the life we have. And it is easy to begin to feel like God is not helping me when he's just showered, not just me, but humanity with just a world and a universe of blessings.
Yeah, absolutely. It's when we go back, I think, to what we talked about earlier, how we're not focusing on that. We're focusing on ourselves. We're focusing on the things that we think we need or that we think we want, instead of thinking about what God's already given us. Okay, moving on here, we're going to go ahead and read verses, where are we at here? Let's start in verse 26 and read through 31. Seth King, would you mind reading that?
There the ships move along, and Leviathan which you have formed to sport in it. They all wait for you to give them their food in due season. You give to them, and they gather it up. You open your hand, and they are satisfied with good. You hide your face, they are dismayed. You take away their spirit, they expire and return to their dust. You send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. Let the glory of the Lord endure forever. Let the Lord be glad in his works.
I find it so interesting in verse 31 here. He says, let the glory of the Lord endure forever. He kind of goes back now after he's detailed very descriptively all these different things that God's provided for us, and he's interjecting and peppering in little bits of praise, to God. And I can't help but think, as the psalmist was penning this down, how he just have to stop and appreciate all these things that he's now reminding himself of, similar to Jay's point, when he's actually thinking about them, and can't help but marvel at all that God's given us. Going down to verse 31, we're going to go ahead and just finish off this particular section and go through the end. Let the glory of the Lord endure forever. Let the Lord be glad in his works. He looks at the earth and it trembles. He touches the mountains and they smoke. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have my being. Let my meditation be pleasing to him. As for me, I shall be glad in the Lord. Let sinners be consumed from the earth, and let the wicked be no more. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Praise the Lord. Not jumping too far ahead, but towards the end, I was kind of stunned by what he says here in verse 35, when he says, let the sinners be consumed from the earth, and let the wicked be no more. Why do you think the psalmist would include this particular phrase in a psalm that is so geared on God's glory, his majesty, and his wonders?
It's almost an affront to God to essentially live in his house and actively oppose him. It's like if I walked into your house and just started knocking stuff off the shelves and tracking in mud. These people who have no regard for God, let alone for what he has made, what he has done, just sort of using it, and in some cases using it up. We may be seeing that more now than when the psalmist was writing this, but it's almost as if with a blessing this great, you would want to preserve it and keep anyone out that wouldn't appreciate it.
Yeah, to be clear, we don't know. I thought this would be an interesting thing just to discuss, because it's such a stark contrast from really the light tone that and the almost Disney-esque theme that's been presented here. But it's very interesting to me that he chooses to say, let them be consumed from the earth. Yeah.
I think it also speaks to, throughout this whole psalm, he is like glorifying everything that he has done and everything that the earth is. And really, like, if there was no sinners on the earth, it would be exactly how God intended the earth to be, like, just perfect. And so I feel like it also, like, that would be a perfect world if there was no sinners. And so I feel like it kind of goes on with that.
That's interesting. I wasn't thinking about that. That's very interesting. I think that the psalmist was so convicted. My personal thought around this is that the psalmist was so convicted on what he had seen throughout, all these different accounts, that he was wanting to make sure that anybody who didn't have the same appreciation felt that way. And I think that it's only a natural end for those who reject God, who reject what he's done, what he's given us, and that's why, we see it there. Moving on, the last question that I want to leave us with, that we can spend the last couple of minutes talking about, is what we really take away from this entire psalm. We see such a deep appreciation for God's creation here and the purpose that he's given us. Why else might we focus on this in our walk today, just as the psalmist has?
Well, having that big picture view definitely makes the little things seem a lot less important that we're kind of struggling with.
Yeah.
Just always thinking big. Like, wow, this is a great earth I'm living on. Lucky to have a chance to be like breathing again, walking around.
Yeah, absolutely. It gives us context.
I think as a parent, you go and take this psalm and it's something to instill in your children. Because when you're young and something goes awry, you're just mad and you don't like anything. But as you mature and as you see the way the world works and you see God's plan, everything happens for a reason. Whether it strengthens you from not being so anxious or whether it keeps you from losing your temper. But through time, God's handiwork is here to make us appreciate God and to look for him in all things. And even those who don't walk in his ways, we need to look at them and understand that they could change and learn to appreciate it if maybe we do something to want to bring them back. And so I think it's important that the appreciation for what's around us, it's learning to express that and share that with others so that they can have that appreciation also.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a teaching tool. It's a bridge to connect with those people, I think. Where does Satan want our focus?
On him.
What?
Not God.
Not God. On
On
ourselves.
Ourselves.
On ourselves. And I think one of the things that I take, maybe I'm stretching too much for you guys, I know it's Wednesday, is that, Satan wants to do anything he can to take our focus off of God and put it on ourselves. He wants to use us and our pride and our selfishness to, serve him. And when I think about this particular psalm, it's really many of the psalms that have this same type of theme. It helps me think how I can't help but appreciate God and put my focus on him when I'm reading things like this. And I think that's one of the best tools that we can have in our daily walk, and something that we can remember.
That's an interesting point. I like that. You got me thinking back in the Old Testament in Genesis 3. Here, Adam and Eve are living in the truly unspoiled paradise earth. And yet Satan is determined to get them to think, no, God isn't good. He's giving you all these great gifts. But no, he's bad because this one fruit he doesn't want you to eat. It's a statement of a glaring example of what you just mentioned here.
Yeah, and I didn't even connect and think about that one, but that's maybe the ultimate example of this point. If we today struggle to not put that emphasis on self and focus on God's creation, just think about Adam and Eve. They kind of had, we're all, I think, guilty of glamorizing some of those examples and thinking, oh, well, of course I want to be in that situation, but if that situation played out, you know, in that manner, then there is no reason why we shouldn't be reminding ourselves of this each and every day. And that's a great point. Any other comments?
I think there's like the very simplicity of it, you know, with nature and everything, how that's literally something that people go to get away from themselves, get away from everything else. There's some kind of elemental nature of peace and serenity and just getting together. That's why national parks exist. There's why, you know, people travel, do all these things. I think just, even if, you know, people who aren't Christians go and do that and can just enjoy it and being out in nature, there's something about it. And I think this psalm kind of like brings it to life, because there is an element about it that is life-giving, because it is all life at the same point.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Nick, you're teaching on Sunday, right?
That's correct.
All right.